Deep in the jungles of Myanmar, a brutal civil war is raging. On the one side is a military dictatorship, a cabal of generals that took control of their nation years ago and have carried out countless atrocities against the people they swore to safeguard. Their leader, General Min Aung Hlaing, vows gruesome retribution against those who dare to oppose him and relies on the world's ignorance of his nation to rule as he pleases. On the other side is nothing short of a rebel alliance, a collection of resistance armies, insurgent militias, and ordinary people taking up arms in defense of their families and communities. The tip of their spear, a tripartite rebel army known as the Three Brotherhood Alliance, has taken much of the country by storm, turning what was once a patchwork of fruitless local insurgencies into a force that could very well topple its enemy. At the time of writing, it's the waning days of August 2024, and the rebels are moving toward their endgame. With the military junta defeated in the countryside and running scared from the sorts of major bases that a year ago it seemed impossible that the rebels would ever capture, Min Aung Hlaing and his dictatorship are running out of places to hide, and the table is now set for what will be a final showdown in the coming months. So in this special episode today, we're going to prepare for that showdown and explore both the stunning victories and the lasting obstacles of a resistance that can sense just how close it is to taking its country back. At the outset of this special episode today, we've got to make one thing clear. Although the rebels of Myanmar are fighting against a brutal military dictatorship, this is not so clear-cut good guy against clear-cut bad guy. For the sake of time, we're not going to be launching into the long history of the conflict today or the generations-old insurgencies that preceded it, and we won't be doing an in-depth exploration of either the ruling military junta or the country's various resistance groups beyond what is needed to understand the conflict's current state. If you'd like a longer deep dive into the Myanmar conflict, please do let us know in the comments, and we would be glad to oblige if the interest is there. But for now, we just ask that you take us at our word when we say that this is a deeply complex civil war in a deeply complex nation. Every organization involved has its own story, has its own reasons for believing and acting as it does, and has its fair share of skeletons in the closet. That includes the ruling junta, but it also includes the rebels, despite what many around the world see quite fairly as the nobility of their higher cause. Myanmar's civil war is being fought between the ruling junta and quite literally hundreds of militias, most of whom are organized along ethnic or geographic lines. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to sort them into three core categories today: the junta, the Three Brotherhood Alliance, and the others. The military junta ruling Myanmar is, as we said before, organized under the command of General Min Aung Hlaing. They came to power in 2021 after a coup d'etat that overthrew the nation's indirectly elected state chancellor, the Nobel laureate and fellow complicated individual Aung San Suu Kyi. Based in the capital city of Naypyidaw in the heart of Myanmar, the junta rules by force, relying on the national military, known as the Tatmadaw, to assert control in the cities and in the countryside. They also draw support from various ethnic militias that rally to the junta's cause. The Tatmadaw is organized, at least in its own ideal world, in a staggered structure. It maintains major military bases and complete control over the biggest cities. It stations regional commands in each area of the country. It keeps the countryside dotted with a range of smaller military bases in and around towns, and in the rural areas it stations troops at countless outposts and checkpoints. Between the junta's ever-present troops all across the nation and their long-running use of indiscriminate air raids and shelling against civilian populations who are perceived to be dissident, they've been able to keep control over their nation until recently. Then there are the members of the Three Brotherhood Alliance, who we'll be referring to as the 3BHA for the remainder of the episode. The 3 in the 3BHA refers to the trio of founding members within the alliance: the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, or MNDAA, and the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, whom, to spare you an acronym, we'll just refer to as the Ta'ang from here on forward. The three groups got together in 2019, when all three were waging separate battles against the Tatmadaw well before their coup took over the country. Although the three were, at that time, getting a bit worse than they were giving from the Tatmadaw, they were able to coordinate their attacks and stabilize the regions where they were fighting after they banded together. After the coup, they didn't declare war on the junta right away, instead consolidating their territory and training thousands of troops while making inroads with other resistance groups, especially in the cities. During that time, they stood by and watched while the junta spread itself thin while fighting various ethnic militias from other parts of Myanmar until they seized their moment to strike. On the 27th of October 2023, the 3BHA launched Operation 1027, a massive assault on the junta that continues to this day. Finally, there are the others, the many militias and armies fighting for their own aims but fundamentally in opposition to the junta. Some of them have been fighting the junta for decades, while others recently started. Some are so small as to comprise only a few dozen fighters, while others can field an army in the tens of thousands. Like the rest of their nation, they are long accustomed to asymmetric warfare, operating in the jungles and the hills where the junta's heavy equipment can't reach. Among the most prominent are the Karen National Liberation Army, the Kachin Independence Army, the Chin Brotherhood Alliance, the Pei-O National Liberation Army, and more. Representing most of them, along with the 3BHA, are the National Unity Government, a government in exile that lives and works in hiding inside Myanmar and handles both internal affairs between the militias and foreign relations with the governments of other nations eager to support an alternative to the ruling junta. Although none of these other groups were formally a part of Operation 1027, many of them have seized on the moment or have taken their cues to open new offensives of their own, rallying alongside the 3BHA to put pressure on the junta from all angles. Since the start of Operation 1027, the relative unity between the major members of the resistance has led to a cascade of defeats for the junta. Viewers of our ongoing weekly series, The Situation Room, make sure you're subscribed, will already know the pattern that we're about to describe. But for those who are unfamiliar, the civil war has settled into a consistent rhythm. To understand it, though, we need to understand a couple of things about the Tatmadaw loyal to the junta, and specifically their troops. Most of those troops are somewhat lacking in training, many are lacking in fighting discipline or experience, and by and large, they typically prefer to live to tomorrow instead of dying for their country today. What that has meant for this current phase of the conflict is that the junta's troops are generally open to the idea of retreat or even surrender, and when they have a good understanding of the idea that whatever target they're supposed to defend is probably going to fall one way or the other, then they're usually pretty happy to leave town rather than see the fight play itself out. This grand rhythm then goes something like this. Junta troops in a certain part of the country, scattered around between innumerable small, hard-to-defend outposts, hear rumors that the rebel army in their area has been blazing through outposts without much trouble. So, when they hear word that the rebels are coming, they pick up their stuff, pile into the customary Toyotas and Jeeps that you'd expect to find in any nation's countryside during a civil war, and get the hell out before the rebels show up. Then, once that process repeats itself enough times that most of the outposts are vacated, the rebels will show that they can consistently take the next biggest target. Let's say the small bases outside so many of Myanmar's towns. Next time the rebels come calling, the troops on whichever base is in their crosshairs are probably going to pick up, get into the Toyotas and Jeeps, and get the hell out. The same process repeats at the next highest level, the local major bases, and then at the level of regional command centers, and eventually the hardest targets of all, the cities and the core military bases. Right now, the rebels are climbing that ladder, consistently able to take over the biggest local bases and demonstrating that they can bring down the regional command centers. The junta has taken major losses, including major numbers of fatalities for its troops, but often the Tatmadaw will withdraw rather than fight, even when they're leaving behind weapons, heavy fighting equipment, supplies, and resistance prisoners. Or, as happened many times, they'll surrender en masse, in the hundreds, including even the generals unlucky enough to get posted to regional defense. Morale among junta troops in the countryside is at an all-time low. Resistance expertise in rooting them out and forcing them to retreat is at an all-time high. The rebels have captured border checkpoints, they've established arrangements with neighbor nations, and they've set up local government infrastructure in the territory they control. Meanwhile, the junta, despite their better equipment, simply lacks the means or the will to carry out a counteroffensive. They're being pushed back continually, squeezed into a smaller and smaller corner until hopefully, from the rebels' perspective, the pressure becomes too much to bear. As of now, the colourful map of control in Myanmar is something that the New York Times described best this past April, quoting them, "A kaleidoscopic array of competing influences, fiefs, democratic havens, and drug lord hideouts." The junta controls a decent portion of the country, including a critical stretch of land joining the three largest cities, Yangon, Mandalay, and Naypyidaw. But according to one July article in The Economist, that accounts for just 14% of Myanmar's territory, and just 1/3 of its population in areas that are under junta control. The rest is overtaken. The Karen National Liberation Army and the Karenni control much of the border with China. The Arakan Army, a member of the 3BHA, controls the entire border with Bangladesh. The Chin and the People's Defence Force control much of the border with India, while the Kachin, the Ta'ang, and the MNDAA, and the autonomous region of Wa State, which quite frankly is its own weird little thing that we'll be absolutely discussing some other time, all split the border with Myanmar's critical next-door neighbour, China. The junta controls some territory in the north, some near the border with Laos, and some on Myanmar's long southward stretch of coastline. But each of those patches of territory are soon to be cut off, encircled, and either kept isolated or taken outright. In fact, some of them might already have fallen to the rebels by the time you see this video. If the junta is going to hold out anywhere, it's in those 3 key cities that we mentioned before, supported by the mess of military installations that dot the landscape in that area. This is the junta's power base, and right now, it's a hard-shelled nut that the resistance is trying to figure out how to crack. It's never not a good time to emphasize just how impressive Myanmar's rebels have already been. They've taken incredible amounts of territory, they've largely proved able to run a somewhat coordinated insurgency without killing each other, and they're gaining in power every single day. But with respect to the stunning showing the rebels have put on so far, and with respect to the staggering number of lives that have already been lost, the truth remains. What the rebel alliance just did is the easy part. Taking the cities, along with the junta's major military bases, is a prospect that introduces a whole new level of challenge. Part of the problem is just simple maths. After all, many junta troops have been retreating from so many outposts and bases, then from so many directions, and they're all just streaming into consolidated defensible points where holding out's going to be a lot easier. The regime has a proper nation's worth of military equipment there, and for the rebels to attack these strongholds would be to introduce a new element that's been largely absent. If the rebels do surround the junta's base of power, then they'll have succeeded in putting the Tatmadaw between a rock and a hard place. But as the Tatmadaw becomes less slippery, it has become considerably more resolute. The same troops that weren't willing to defend Provincial Outpost 91426 might find themselves a hell of a lot more willing when they know there's nowhere left to run, and they understand that death awaits them in defeat. Beyond the ability of the junta's troops to consolidate and potentially even to rally are the other difficult realities that come with a more concentrated defending force. The Tatmadaw's tanks and armored fighting vehicles, its strafing ground attack aircraft, and its rare but talented elite shock troops don't make much difference when they're sent into the countryside in small numbers. But they work a hell of a lot better if 100 tanks, a dozen fighter jets, and a battalion of actually decent troops happen to be in the same place at the same time. The idea that they could place a unified rebel army at a numeric disadvantage at this stage in the war seems unlikely, but the junta still has the means to place them at a material and firepower disadvantage if they choose when and where to fight. And the downside of having pushed the junta out of much of Myanmar is that they're now a whole lot harder to ambush. Not only that, but they can draw on more tightly controlled supply lines, substantial reserves of critical resources, and although the junta has never been popular in Myanmar, there are loyalists for them to draw on as well. It's unclear just how long the junta could survive a siege stuck on perhaps the 10% of territory that it controls most firmly, but with sea access and the bulk of its firepower, that answer is more likely to be on the scale of years than on the scale of weeks. So, now we come to the quandary that Myanmar's resistance groups are puzzling through as we speak. If we assume that the rest of the territory currently under Tatmadaw control will fall sooner rather than later, and the junta is backed up into the territory it most securely controls, then what the hell comes next? This is a question that someone somewhere within the resistance probably has some answers to, but whatever those answers are, they haven't been shared with the global public. And what those plans certainly are not are to just launch a full frontal assault and see tens of thousands on both sides mowed down. Instead, we're going to pose a series of 3 hypothetical options to you based on a combination of expert opinions on what the next phase of this war might look like, and perhaps a little bit of educated guesswork on our part. And for the sake of keeping you in suspense, we'll start with the long shot and then work our way up to Plan A. The long shot is the prospect of a direct intervention in Myanmar's ongoing conflict by a more powerful neighbor. Not Thailand to the south, not India to the west, but China to the north. China has long used a heavy hand in Myanmar, backing governments or pushing them down as Beijing sees fit, but their approach has been as nuanced as it's been forceful. For a long time, China has balanced itself in the ongoing conflict, sending weapons to militias, including groups that it knows will trade with the Three Brotherhood Alliance and other resistance organizations, but simultaneously supplying the junta with the military equipment it needs to survive. But now China's hedging has turned into what writer Lucas Myers described for War on the Rocks as, quote, mismanaging of the unmanageable. And rather than stay stagnant in a strategy that's no longer working, Beijing has adjusted in a way that the junta has not been happy to see. With Ming Aung troops getting their asses kicked all up and down the jungles of Myanmar, China has worked to establish relations with the resistance groups that now occupy the other side of their border. And Beijing has been thankful to the Three Brotherhood Alliance in helping to tamp down on a cyber scamming industry in Myanmar that defrauds Chinese citizens of billions of US dollars worth of money every year. China has still played both sides of the conflict, but its decisions have broadly favored the Three Brotherhood Alliance, recognizing that even if Beijing would prefer the junta in charge, that's a prospect that probably can't be recovered at this stage. The junta may or may not believe that it could retake Myanmar with China's help, but one thing it knows for certain, and that's that it's royally screwed if China comes down on the other side. As a result, the junta's current posture toward Beijing has less to do with making any specific requests for major assistance and more with just kissing Xi Jinping's arse and hoping for the best. For the short term, that approach seems to be working. At the time of writing, China has just recently promised that it would help the junta run a census and then an election, while politely brushing off Min Aung Hlang's accusations that Beijing is sending weapons to the resistance. That promise for electoral support is most likely an attempt to offer the junta a way out of its mess, in hopes that the conflict can still be drawn down. But say the junta plays its current hand poorly, perhaps by insisting that a peaceful reconciliation is impossible, and as a result, China concludes that supporting the junta is no longer in its interest. The thing that comes next could happen in two ways. Option one, the more likely one, is that China's material support for the resistance would increase. Perhaps that could include the shipment of more or better weapons. Perhaps it could involve the provision of a wider array of supplies, or perhaps it could include the delivery of armor, artillery, and other heavy equipment that the junta has thus been lacking so far. Option two is less likely, but it bears consideration anyhow. Chinese boots on the ground. That could come in a few ways. Perhaps by temporarily removing the uniforms and badges of some elite troops or fighter pilots or what have you, and sending them in as unidentified mercenaries like Russia did in Crimea in 2014. Or it could involve limited postings of Chinese troops to deter the junta from engaging in attacks or counterattacks, or in an extreme scenario, China could send its army in with intent to kill. Any of these options are not likely. After all, Beijing is very cautious when it comes to military matters and has a long history of declining to intervene in moments like this. But with Beijing looking to signal and test its preparedness for war, there's a small but real possibility that Myanmar could be a place for troops to pick up experience in live combat. But nonetheless, Chinese intervention is what we'll classify as the least likely of our three scenarios, perhaps calling it Plan C for obvious reasons. But if that's Plan C, then Plan B centers not around China, but the Tatmadaw. As we explained previously, the Tatmadaw is going through a very hard time at this stage in the conflict, and to say the morale is in the toilets is quite frankly an insult to toilets. Even Tatmadaw soldiers who've retreated to the strongholds have a keen recollection of their superiors' struggle and often disinterest in getting them food or basic medical care, of the junta's willingness to direct them to stay and die defending outposts that everyone knew were a lost cause. Many remember being forced to serve in the military in the first place, despite never having had the slightest intention of signing up. We've posited that those same troops, backed into a corner with more allies beside them but nowhere to run, might find it within themselves to stand and fight. But what if the battle they're waiting for simply never arrives? Let's say that the many rebel armies enclose the junta in its cities and its bases, and then wait. Let's say the rebels cook Min Aung Hlaing and his generals, and cook their troops along with them in a long and arduous slow roasting that sees supplies dwindle, food reserves run out, and vectors of escape be slowly eliminated. The Tatmadaw is well accustomed to overthrowing leaders of Myanmar that don't follow its will, and if you squint and tilt your head just a little bit, Min Aung Hlaing is a leader of Myanmar, regardless of what the patches on his chest might indicate of his station. If military morale can be pushed low enough, the rebels stand a chance at making one of two things happen while they hold their perimeter. Either some of the generals within Min Aung Hlaing's own leadership get restless, eventually toppling him and replacing him with a figure willing to negotiate a return to nationwide civilian government, or the generals don't get a choice amidst a mutiny by junior officers and enlisted troops who've had to go hungry for too long. Either way, the process of getting there will take time, but there's certainly a chance. And by planting the seeds of rebellion, we also find our way to Plan A, perhaps the rebels' best chance at breaking the junta's strongholds wide open. That, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the prospect of a popular revolt, not by the ethnic militias in the countryside, but the people of the cities. The junta loyalists who do exist in Myanmar primarily call its biggest cities home, and even there the junta tends to rule more by fear than by love. In one example of the junta's willingness to shake even the confidence of its city-dwelling citizens, this past February saw a return of mass conscription laws in junta-controlled areas. The junta followed up on the conscription drive they promised, sending thousands of unwilling young men and women out to the front lines at a time when support was already dwindling. Thousands of young people fled to join resistance groups or left the country outright. In much of Myanmar, including the major cities, ordinary people would quite like to see a return to civilian leadership and democratic rule, and many people are horrified, as one might expect, by the incredible brutality the junta has shown against its own civilians elsewhere. Although the people of Yangon and Mandalay may not share an ethnicity or a home with the people the junta has massacred, one thing is abundantly clear. Simply being a citizen of Myanmar is not enough to stop Min Aung Hlaing from turning on you when he sees fit. The resistance has already begun to put the pressure on the junta in those cities, including drone and rocket attacks on Naypyidaw, bomb attacks in Yangon, and visible massing near the most vulnerable of 3 cities, Mandalay. The message is clear. Even in your strongholds, we can get to you, and we're coming. Each of the 3 cities has some limited strategic vulnerability to worry about. Mandalay is on the fringes of junta territory and is backed onto a river that can be used to encircle it, while Naypyidaw isn't far from a major resistance group's territory, and Yangon is backed up to the sea, making it vulnerable from that direction if Myanmar's southern tail is taken over. But far more important is the work that the resistance has already done and will continue to do inside the cities. Elements of the major rebel groups are already inside the cities, especially the People's Defense Force, the multi-ethnic group that serves as an armed wing of the National Unity Government. They're widely understood to be recruiting, establishing rebel cells, and laying the groundwork for the stage that comes next. The hope appears to be that they can either dismantle the major cities from inside or more likely inspire the public to join a mass popular revolt. If they can do that, toppling one of the cities, perhaps 2 or even 3, then the junta will lose many of its troops and be forced into a defense solely from its largest bases, a losing effort that the junta probably wouldn't be inclined or equipped to continue for long. If the rebels are able to force a breakthrough, it's likely going to be through one of 3 paths: getting lucky with China, cooking the cities until the Tatmadaw collapses, or inspiring an even greater uprising among the people of Myanmar. But there's also a very real chance that such a breakthrough will be slow to come, or perhaps won't come at all. If the junta can play its cards right and focus on withdrawing and holding its stronghold territory at all costs, then it's unlikely that a full-scale attack by the rebels would be enough if the rebels aren't able to arm themselves to the level that they could truly go toe-to-toe. Remember, these are organizations built and trained for asymmetric warfare, and while they're not incapable of learning to use the tanks and artillery they capture, they can't overcome their current equipment deficit through heart and fighting spirit alone. It's here that we conclude with an eye to the future, and the many ways that this conflict could either end or at the very least be drawn down into a lower intensity struggle while some semblance of order returns to most places. The organization that bears primary responsibility for the vision of Myanmar after the war is the National Unity Government, a well-liked organization within Myanmar that's proved able to command the enthusiasm of a wide range of ethnic militias and peacetime leaders. The National Unity Government captures strong support across ethnicities, with one study in early 2024 indicating that nearly 9 in 10 members of Myanmar's diaspora population around the world have a somewhat or highly favorable opinion of them. Those numbers only count for so much, considering that most polled people weren't living in Myanmar at the time, but they do mean something, and the National Unity Government does have a plan. They've got a president, a vice president, a state councillor, a prime minister, a full set of ministers, and more, all in exile and waiting for the opportunity to take the lead. They are highly influential, and if the various factions of Myanmar's resistance choose to support them, then the plan for governance and international recognition that they offer actually seems as if it could work. But there's no guarantee that those same resistance organizations would support the National Unity Government if push came to shove, and in the Myanmar that would likely result from a defeat of the junta, no faction is likely to be powerful enough to assert control of the others. The National Unity Government's armed wing is powerful, but not powerful enough to pacify the major resistance groups, let alone if the 3BHA remains allied and chooses not to play nice. The Tatmadaw would be shattered by that point, perhaps rebuilding, but not fast enough to assert any real level of control. Nor would any of the resistance groups, even the 3BHA, be able to take power for themselves. And the idea that they'd all get behind the National Unity Government is far from a guarantee. Every single one of these organizations acts in its own interest, with its own set of incentives, often prioritizing its own ethnic or regional community above any other. Some are autocratic in the territory they control, some are negligent, some are exploitative, and some, like the Arakan army of the 3BHA, have a tendency to adopt some of the military junta's worst traits. The Arakan army in particular has been accused of extreme and indiscriminate violence against the country's predominantly Muslim Rohingya minority, the same group that have faced treatment by Myanmar's government that most of the world agrees constituted genocide. Other groups thrive or even depend outright on the drug trade, to the point that last December the UN declared that Myanmar had become the world's leading producer of opium. Methamphetamines aren't exactly a niche industry either, and nor are other sorts of organised crime, including the cyber scams that China so recently thanked the 3BHA for working to constrain. Despite the promises and potential of Myanmar's grand uprising, two equally likely paths forward exist now. The first sees the resistance unify under the National Unity Government, as much of the world hopes they will, but the second sees the National Unity Government diminish to a puppet state at best. With each patch of territory controlled by a different militia and each militia free to rule over its territory as it sees fit, Myanmar could very quickly become a patchwork of autonomous regions minding their own business or fighting as they see fit. Perhaps the National Unity Government rules over one such area. Perhaps they even speak for Myanmar on the global stage. But there's no guarantee that anybody else in Myanmar listens. And in that version of the country, strange as it may be to say, there might still be room for a junta that hasn't fallen at all. If each group rules over 3, 5, 8, 10% of the country's territory, well, what's one more? If one thing is certain, is that Myanmar's civil war is barely inches from its endgame. But that endgame can still go a whole lot of different ways. There's no guarantee that the finished result will even be recognizable as a nation, let alone as Myanmar.